Winters in the Midwest can be freezing, and the thick fog that covers everything makes it even scarier. But what if this fog isn't just fog? What if it brings something dangerous with it? This is the story of Ethan and his friends. Ethan and his friends, Sophia and Liam, were tired of the pollution in Chicago. They decided to take a trip to Colorado for some fresh air. Early one morning, at 4 a.m., they hired a cab and started their journey. The driver, Mark, was friendly and talkative, and everyone got along well. Around 8 a.m., they were still on the road, but it was strangely dark outside. Suddenly, they saw a thick wall of fog ahead. The fog was so dense that they couldn't even see the road anymore. Mark, who had been cheerful earlier, suddenly became quiet and looked nervous. Ethan noticed this and said, "Don't worry, Mark. Just drive slowly, and we'll get through." But Mark looked at him seriously and said, "No matter what happens, don't open the car windows while we're in this fog." The group thought Mark was just being superstitious and laughed it off. But as the car drove deeper into the fog, everything became quiet and eerie. Suddenly, Sophia started feeling sick. She said she couldn't breathe and, without thinking, opened the car window for some air. She leaned out to feel better, and as soon as she did, the fog crept into the car. When Sophia turned back, she froze in shock. The car was empty. Ethan, Liam, and Mark had disappeared. Terrified, she screamed and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Even worse, the car started moving on its own. After a few minutes, the car stopped, and the doors unlocked. Sophia ran out as fast as she could, but all she could see around her was fog. She called out for help, but there was no response. Suddenly, she saw a tall, dark figure in the distance. She ran toward it, but no matter how fast she went, the figure stayed just as far away. Before she could understand what was happening, she felt someone standing behind her. Trembling, she slowly turned around. Her heart sank. Standing there was a 12-foot-tall black figure with glowing eyes. Sophia felt a hard push from behind, and everything went dark. When she woke up, she was back in the car with Ethan, Liam, and Mark. It turned out she had fainted after opening the window, and Mark had been shouting at Liam to close it immediately. They were all trying to calm Sophia down, but she was still shaking. Ethan told Mark to drive faster so they could leave the fog behind. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a girl appeared in front of the car. Mark couldn't stop in time, and they hit her. Panicked, Ethan got out to check on her, but what he saw made his blood run cold. It was Sophia, lying on the road covered in blood. Confused and terrified, Ethan turned back to the car, but it was empty. Mark, Liam, and the real Sophia were gone. Shaking with fear, Ethan put the body in the car and started driving, desperate to escape the fog. But then, the 12-foot-tall black figure appeared again, standing right in the middle of the road. Ethan lost control of the car, and it crashed into a tree. The next morning, locals found the car wrecked by the roadside. All 4 passengers, Ethan, Sophia, Liam, and Mark, were all alive, but barely. However, things were never the same again. Ethan had suffered a serious head injury and lost his mental balance, while Sophia kept seeing the black figure everywhere she went. A couple of years ago, I was living alone in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. This happened during the rainy season, sometime in November. The nights were cold and it had been raining all day. That evening, I was relaxing at home with a cup of tea, watching TV. I wasn't planning to go out because there was a storm warning. The sound of the rain hitting the windows made everything feel peaceful, but also a little spooky because it was so quiet outside. Around 8 p.m., I suddenly heard a knock on my door. It caught me off guard because I wasn't expecting anyone, and it's rare for someone to come by unannounced, especially on a night like this. I got up and looked through the peephole. There was a young woman standing there soaked from the rain with no umbrella or jacket. She looked cold and scared. I opened the door slightly and asked, "Hey, are you okay? What's going on?" She said her boyfriend had kicked her out of his car after a fight and that she had nowhere to go. She asked if she could come inside to warm up while waiting for her mom to pick her up. I felt a bit uneasy, but I also felt bad for her because she was drenched and shivering. After thinking for a moment, I decided to let her in. As soon as she came in, she walked straight to the dining area without saying much. It felt strange, but I didn't say anything. "Sorry, just a minute," she said and kept walking toward the back of the apartment. That's when I started to feel something wasn't right. I followed her quietly to see what she was doing. When I got closer, I saw her at the back door, unlocking it. Before I could react, 2 men suddenly came inside through the door. That's when I realized it was a setup. I panicked and ran straight to my bedroom. I could hear their footsteps behind me. Once I got into my room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open the window. The men were banging on the door, trying to get in. Without wasting any time, I climbed out of the window and landed on the wet ground outside. It was raining heavily and I was soaked, but I didn't stop running. I kept going until I reached the street. Once I was far enough, I pulled out my phone and called the police. Standing in the rain, I waited and kept looking back at my apartment. When the police arrived, the men and the woman were already gone. They had gone through my things and stolen a few items, but thankfully it wasn't much. That night, I learned a big lesson. Never let a stranger into your home, no matter how helpless they seem. After that, I installed a doorbell camera and stopped opening the door without checking first. It was a scary experience, but I'm grateful that I made it out safe. When I was around 15 or 16, my family lived in a small house in Colorado. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods. We didn't stay there long, but one memory from that house has stuck with me forever. It was January. I remember because it was just a few days after New Year's. My cousin Schurz and I were on school break and planned to have a sleepover at my house. It was our usual thing, staying up late, playing Xbox and watching movies in the living room. That night we were watching a movie. I don't remember what movie it was. It's not important. What I do remember is that halfway through the movie, Schurz kept looking out the window on the right side of the room where we were sitting. At first I thought he was watching the snowfall, but then I noticed how long he had been staring out there. But after a while I noticed he wasn't just looking, he was staring. I asked him what was up, and he said he thought he saw something. I laughed it off, thinking maybe he saw a branch move in the wind or an animal. But Chris stayed quiet, his eyes glued to the window. That's when I saw it too, a shadow. It moved quickly from one tree to another. My heart skipped a beat. The storm outside was loud and it was hard to see clearly, but we both froze. A person out here in a snowstorm? We lived miles away from anyone, and there was no reason for someone to be on our property, especially at night. Minutes passed and nothing happened. We started convincing ourselves that it was just the wind or maybe our imaginations. But then it happened again. Another shadow, this time further to the left, closer to the house. By now we were panicking. Chris whispered, "There's more than one." We saw figures darting between trees, one after another. But then one figure stopped. It stood still, just outside the tree line. For a few seconds it didn't move. Then suddenly it started running, straight toward the house. We didn't wait to see what would happen. I run upstairs to wake my dad. By the time he came down with me, Chris said the figure had disappeared. We explained everything. My dad looked worried, which wasn't like him. He checked all the doors and windows, made sure everything was locked, then grabbed his shotgun and went outside to look around. When he came back, he said he didn't see anything. Still, Chris and I convinced him to stay with us in the living room. He agreed, and we all stayed up that night, listening to the storm. The next morning, the snowstorm had almost stopped. Chris and I went outside to check around. That's when we saw it. Footprints in the snow, lots of them. They circled the trees near the living room window and even came close to the house. The snow had partially covered them, but they were still clear enough to see. Even creepier, we found our shed door wide open. The only thing missing was a set of hunting knives my dad kept there. My dad didn't call the police. He said it wasn't worth it since we were already planning to move in a couple of weeks. But the thought of someone, or maybe multiple people, walking around our property in the middle of a snowstorm, it still makes me feel bad. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. All I know is that night changed how I feel about being alone in the woods. Some memories stay with you forever, no matter how much you try to forget.